each one of us in this room is a leader. As I look around the room and as I saw people coming in, I recognize individuals who I've met across the country and people who have taken a stand in their own community, people who were willing to physically put themselves on the line to challenge this corrupt system. And this gathering today is of consequence because we are participating in a unified field here, which resonates with people all over the country and all over the world.
I have never met anyone who does not want peace or an end to war, but I have met countless people who do not believe we can achieve it. So that has led me to believe that the most entrenched obstacle we face is not the Pentagon, corporations, or the military-industrial complex. Our greatest challenge is to help people believe peace is possible so that we can have the political and social will to achieve it.
I was in the emergency hospital, one run by a wonderful crew of Italians. I have O-negative blood, so they're always glad to see me, in Kabul. And I asked them, do you have any survivors of the Kunduz hospital bombing with whom we might talk? And they said, oh, sure, this kid will love to have some visitors. This kid was Khalid Ahmed. He was a pharmacist. His mother told him, don't go to work because it was so dangerous. But he assured his mother, the hospital's never going to be bombed. And so he was awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning and in great fear, seeing the patients he had recently treated burning in their own beds, seeing that there were laser-like bombs being fired at all directions, knowing that they had to take apart their cell phones because they knew that the United States technology was such that these planes could lock on your cell phone and possibly kill you. He was told by security guards, make a run for it. Khalid ran, and he got to the gate, and he took shrapnel in his back. He rolled himself into a ditch. He'd taken apart his cell phone, but in Afghan culture, you call your father, you get in touch with your father if you know you're going to die, and you tell your father you're sorry for anything you might ever have done to hurt him or the family. And this young man with the one arm still working, losing consciousness, managed to put together the cell phone, call home, reached his mother. His mother is beside herself, and he kept saying, I must talk to Dad. Put Dad on the phone. And very fortunately, when the father got on the phone, he said, my son, take off your sweater, put it under you to stop the bleeding. Where are you? And he learned exactly where Khalid was. And relatives lived nearby. They fetched him out of the ditch and a 5-hour drive to the next place where you could get health care in Kabul. When I met him, he asked me, why would your people want to do this to us? We were only trying to help people. And Matt Aiken's really one of the finest war correspondents, I think, in the United States, wrote in a New York Times magazine response to the U.S. military report. And when the U.S. finally issued its report, its investigation of the Kunduz bombing, it said, it was a disproportionate attack against a non-existent threat. Well, weren't they describing every single war this country has waged, a disproportionate response to a non-existent threat?
When I was ambassador in Uzbekistan, where the United States was cooperating with a dreadful dictatorship and where the CIA was sending people to be tortured as part of the Extraordinary Rendition Program, the reason for that alliance was mainly that American companies, initially Enron, in fact, had signed contracts to monopolize Uzbekistan's natural gas reserves, and there was a plan to build a pipeline from Central Asia over Afghanistan, which was to be built by a company called Unocal. And the contract between Enron and the government of Uzbekistan was actually signed in the office of the governor of Texas, while George W. Bush was governor of Texas. And George H.W. Bush was on the board of Unocal, who were meant to build the pipeline over Afghanistan. And that was the reason, if you like, for the Uzbek-US alliance, which I found, particularly the extraordinary rendition part, unconscionable, which I tried to stop, and instead I got sacked.
The United States government recently gave more than $1 million to the family of one victim it had killed in one of its wars. The victim happened to be Italian. If you were to find all the Iraqi families with any surviving members who had loved ones killed by the United States, it might be about 1 million families. 1 million times $1 million would be enough to treat those Iraqis in this respect as if they were Europeans. Who can tell me? Raise your hand. How much is 1 million times 1 million? Right here. 1 trillion. Now, can you please count to 1 trillion starting with 1? Go ahead, we'll wait. You can. The problem with that is it would take, if you got to 1 number every second, it would take 31,709 years. And we have other speakers to get to.
One of the first hearings I had was as a member of the Government Oversight Committee. The Pentagon was asked to come forward to justify their budget, their spending, and it turned out they had over $1 trillion, T for trillion, dollars in accounts that had not and could not be reconciled. $1 trillion.
Bombing people in Muslim countries is not creating security for Americans and is creating hell for the people in these countries. Wars are a tremendous waste of money. $2 trillion down a year down the drain, half of that spent by the United States.
And when I saw they couldn't account for the spending, I was determined from that moment not to vote for a single appropriation for arms, for the military, and I kept that through 16 years in Congress. Because it's all a waste of money and it's a racket. You know, they try to justify this by saying, well, protect our troops. Right? We heard that. We heard that at the beginning of the Iraq War. We have to keep funding the war to protect our troops. And we were saying, protect them, bring them home.
So everyone says they're for peace, even people like President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, men who are directly responsible for the killing of thousands of people. Now, not everyone is against war. Many people believe that there are such things as a just war or a necessary war. Although most people like to believe that they think of war as a last resort, in reality they do not. Due in large part to the corporate-owned media, they often think that it is an either-or situation, go to war or do nothing. Many people don't know about or understand the power of nonviolence or are aware of the other tools that can be used in place of violence, militarism, and war.
Of course, people like to imagine that there have been a few justifiable wars, so that the chance of another one outweighs all the destruction of endless war preparation, plus all the unjustifiable wars that preparation produces. The United States simply had to fight a revolution against England. Although nonviolent corrections to injustices were working damn well, and the reason that Canada hasn't had to fight a revolution against England yet is because there are no touchdowns in hockey or something.
We are explaining to people that these ties with the Saudis have spanned 12 different administrations, Democrat and Republican, that we have to recognize that we are in bed with the regime that cuts off the heads of peaceful dissidents, that has no elections for president, no elections for any Congress, that uses the death penalty for everything from homosexuality to the spread of atheism. Any atheists in the room? Yeah, well, you would have a hard time in Saudi Arabia.
The United States has deployed missile defense system, so-called missile defense system, into Romania, what they call Aegis Ashore. The Aegis warships made in Bath, Maine, where I live, are outfitted with these missile defense systems, SM-3 interceptor missile, and in fact they have the best testing record of all the various missile defense systems. There are about 4 or 5 different missile defense systems. Some test better than others. This one tests the best. So well that they decided, let's call it Aegis Ashore as well and put it on the ground. And so the first permanent Aegis Ashore deployment is now in Romania. And they're going to do another one in Poland next year. Oops. So the groundbreaking here, it looks like they're digging a grave, but actually it's a groundbreaking for these systems. They're very excited about Aegis Ashore, and they have the testing area on the island of Kauai in Hawaiian Islands for the Aegis Ashore system. So coupled with the onboard ships and this particular system, they're very excited about it. And what you should know about missile defense is that it's a key element in U.S. first strike attack planning. The idea is that after you launch a first strike attack on Russia or China, try to take out their ground-based nuclear forces, they then fire a retaliatory strike. And it is then that missile defense is used as a shield to pick off the retaliatory strike, giving the U.S. a quote-unquote successful first strike attack.
We have seen the resources of this country squandered in this racket called war. And we've seen both political parties participate. And we've seen presidents who were elected as, quote, anti-war, turn around and keep funding wars ad infinitum. We've seen political parties take cash from defense contractors and keep the war machine going. We've seen Democratic political leaders promise a new Congress in 2006 to take America in a direction of stopping the war. They got that new Congress, and the minute they took office, they kept the war going again, and they kept funding it. We have to stop this racket. We have to challenge these people inside the political establishment to stop this racket.
$110 billion worth of sales to Saudi Arabia, more weapons sales than we've ever sold to anybody ever, and the majority of it has come under the Obama administration. A lot of it when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton at one point in the WikiLeaks cable said, "What are we going to do about the Saudis? They keep funding these extremist groups all over the world." What did she do? She authorized more weapons sales to Saudi Arabia.
The United States simply had to kill 750,000 people and then end slavery, even though slavery didn't end, because all of those other countries that ended slavery without doing that, and this city we are sitting in that ended slavery without doing that, lack the valuable heritage of the Confederate flag and all the bitter racist resentment we so cherish, or something.
I saw it in 1999 when Bill Clinton needed authorization to continue an air war against Serbia, when there were maybe 1 million people in the streets of Belgrade protesting their own government, and then we unleashed violence against them and cut short the change and actually ended up helping Milosevic.
That one of the reasons we don't hear more about Saudi Arabia is they have bought consent or silence with a lot of their petrodollars. We buy the oil, they make the money, and they put the money into spreading their distorted version of Islam, not the peace-loving Islam the majority of people in this world practice, but their distorted view of Islam, and then they also put the money into buying favorite views from things like major universities like the one we're in right now, Ivy League schools all over this country, foundations like you've heard of the Clinton Foundation, got between $10 and $25 million from the Saudis. Even Jimmy Carter's lovely foundation, Saudi money. I was sitting in a hearing 2 days ago listening to John McCain rail against the Iranians, thinking, why does he rail against the Iranians instead of or in addition to the Saudis? And I just Googled John McCain, Saudi Arabia, and realized that he got $1 million from the Saudis for his institute.
World War II was totally justifiable, because President Roosevelt was 6 days off in his prediction of the Japanese attack he'd worked to provoke. The U.S. and England refused to evacuate Jewish refugees from Germany. The Coast Guard chased a ship of them away from Miami. The State Department denied Anne Frank's visa request. All peace efforts to halt the war and liberate the camps were blocked. Several times the number of people who died in the camps died outside of them in the war. The all-out destruction of civilians and the permanent militarization of the United States have been disastrous precedents. The fantasy of Germany taking over the Western Hemisphere just as soon as it took over the Soviet Union was based on forged documents of Karl-Rovian quality. The United States gave syphilis to its Negro soldiers during the war and to Guatemalans during the Nuremberg trials, and the U.S. military hired hundreds of former top Nazis at the end of the war, and they fit right in. but this was a question of good versus evil.
There was not a shred of evidence, legitimate evidence, after 9/11. We all know this, that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11, with Al-Qaeda's role in 9/11. Iraq had nothing to do with the weapons of mass destruction. I stopped going to meetings of the Democratic caucus. I called it the Democratic carcass. Years before I left Congress, because all they talked about was how bad the Republicans are, polling and raising money. Now, I've talked to friends of mine in the Republican Party who said that what they generally talk about in the Republican conference is how bad the Democrats are, polling and raising money. That's the difference between the two-party system. We can simultaneously and must challenge these wars, and at the same time create new structures to assure peace, so that someday in America, some child will be able to grow up without having to have lived through the government prosecuting a war in their name.
Over 80% of the people killed in wars are civilians. 180 million people were killed in wars in the last century. Wars are not working. As we have seen in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, the more we use military means to try to resolve these conflicts, the deeper embedded we become in the endless morass of war.
The Congo has been caught in the midst of a geostrategic battle. In fact, that was the crucible in which the modern nation was born. Because at the Berlin Conference in 1880-1885, 14 European nations and the United States gathered to determine the fate of an entire continent. In fact, that Berlin Conference was also called the Congo Conference, and the Congo was seen as a great prize. And because European powers didn't want to go to war against each other for that great prize, they gave it to King Leopold II as his own personal property. And the United States was the first government to recognize the ownership of the Congo under King Leopold II. In fact, one of the main lobbyists was a gentleman by the name of Harry Sanford. And some of you may be familiar with that name because there is a city or a town in Florida that was named after him, Sanford, Florida, where the modern-day Black Lives Matter movement got its origin. It's there in Sanford, Florida, where you had Trayvon Martin that was assassinated or murdered by George Zimmerman. And it was uranium that was extracted from the Congo under the Belgians that fueled the atomic weapons that were dropped on Japan in World War II. However, with Lumumba taking such a strong stance as a nationalist and a Pan-Africanist, this sent shudders through Western capitals. And within a matter of weeks, Lumumba was deposed by the CIA. And not only did the United States overthrow Lumumba, but they also imposed a dictatorship on the Congolese people for another 3 decades. The United Nations says it's the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. Therefore, every peace group, every anti-war group should have Congo on their lips. If we're talking about the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II, and if we know that at the root of it, the weakness of the Congolese state that allows that many people to perish is based on a U.S. foreign policy that overthrew a democratically elected leader, imposed a dictatorship for 3 decades, and then when you had democratic forces ready, nonviolent, pro-democracy forces ready to remove that dictatorship in the early 1990s, instead of the greatest democracy in the world backing those pro-democratic forces, they backed an invasion, a war by Congo's allies, Rwanda and Uganda in particular.
This new trend of pitching wars as philanthropy picks up a sliver of U.S. public support, but each such war relies on greater support from those who thirst for blood. And because no humanitarian war has yet benefited humanity, this propaganda leans heavily on wars that did not happen. 5 years ago, one simply had to bomb Libya because of Rwanda, where U.S.-backed militarism had created the disaster, and never would bombing anybody have helped anything. A few years later, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, openly and shamelessly wrote that we had a responsibility not to look at the disaster in Libya in order to be properly willing to bomb Syria. And we had to bomb Syria because Rwanda.
Because Congo is giving so much to the world, because we all benefited, each and every one of us has a cell phone. There's coltan that comes from the Congo, fuels our cell phones, fuels our video games. We all benefit from the resources. We're active on social media in organizing. At the very least, we can acknowledge what's happening in the Congo. We can lift up the Congo.
We often end up talking about the media simply reflect power. And I don't think that's true, or at least it certainly isn't always true. George Bush, the first, when he got in, what was the rap on him, the media rap on George Bush the first? He's wobbly. He's a wimp. When he was after Saddam moved into Kuwait, it was, Thatcher got the soundbite. Don't go wobbly on us, George. So Clinton bombed Iraq and continued the sanctions, but was pushed into those positions often. Who here might remember, when Clinton first got into office, what was his position on Iraq? If Saddam Hussein wants a new relationship, I'm a Baptist, I believe in deathbed conversions, we can have a new relationship. Who came after him for that? Great liberal of the New York Times, Tom Friedman, went after him for that. Clinton immediately backtracked. His new incoming Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, said, I'm a Presbyterian, I don't know what Bill's talking about. And Clinton backtracked, and they maintained the sanctions for the duration of Clinton's term. After the invasion of Iraq, what was the media rap on W? Don't cut and run. So I think we have to see how the media, in ways subtle and bad, push the militarism. And we certainly see that vis-a-vis Obama. He backed out. He didn't bomb Syria. He's a pacifist, ignoring the militarism of the Obama administration. That's another manifestation. If people are in D.C. and want to try to give new life for Pacifica, I think that that's a worthwhile effort. Another thing is here, where WAMU is, and tons of other radio stations around the United States are owned by, their license is owned by a university. There are lots of people doing interesting work in universities that never get on the air on public radio. A couple of dozen people downtown tied to the establishment at the NPR building determine the content that ends up being heard on all of these university radio stations. There may well be opportunities to try to revamp that, to reformulate that. There's no single bullet solution, but there are a lot of aspects that we can go at to try to meaningfully change the structure of the media for peace.
What we're going to be showing tonight is episode 3 of the Untold History of the United States. This is the 12-part documentary film series that I made with filmmaker Oliver Stone. It's showed on the Showtime network in the United States. It's going to be up on Netflix next month. It showed, 12 episodes. It's shown all over the world, I think with the exception of China. But the book was a New York Times bestseller for 7 weeks, and it's also been a bestseller in Brazil and Russia. The book is out in about 20 countries right now. We've got several versions of the book. Plus, the big book is 800 pages. Then we did the concise untold history based on the documentary scripts. Then we did doing the young readers edition for middle school students. Volume 1 is out now, 3 more volumes to come. And we also have our graphic novel on the way. Now, some of you might remember that the graphic novel for Howard Zinn's People's History has sold something like 75,000 copies. So there's a good precedent for doing that, trying to reach every audience we can. I'm going out to Texas in a couple weeks to speak to 3,000 high school history teachers in Texas. And so we're trying to get this out as widely as possible all over the world. So it first aired in December 2012 and January 2013 on Showtime. Let me give you a little bit of background. What we're going to show you tonight is episode 3. So people who watched it originally on television would have seen episodes 1 and 2, and they would have known some things that those of you who haven't seen that might not know, although some of you probably do. First of all, who was our Secretary of War in 1945? Right, Henry Stimson. Who became Secretary of State in July 1945? Secretary of State. Jimmy Burns. Okay, so Jimmy Burns is one person we introduce. Stimson is a second. The most important person we introduce here is Henry Wallace. Okay, when I asked my students and others who was Vice President of the United States between 1941 and 45, they might say Truman. They almost never say Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace has been largely written out of history.
It is in the nature of corporate news media, never, if it can get away with it, to accept any information or analysis or facts that conflict with the official line of the national security state, unless that line happens to be to the left of their line, in which case, many times, as Sam has correctly pointed out, the news media have attacked the White House and administration policy if it was not sufficiently hawkish for their liking. The permanent war state, the state institutions and individuals who push for policies and programs to carry out perpetual war must be delegitimized in the same way that those financial elites dominating the economy have been delegitimized for a large segment of the U.S. population already. The campaign should exploit the potent parallel between Wall Street and the national security state in terms of siphoning off trillions of dollars. Tom Drake was a senior official of the NSA, and he's come out, and Tom Drake understands, and I've talked to him about this at length, he understands that the motivation of these people at the top of the NSA was power. They wanted everything. They wanted to scoop up all information for its own sake. And that's a problem that is matched in all of the organs of the national security state. The Pentagon, the uniformed armed services, the CIA, the State Department, and the National Security Council, and those people in the White House who can use U.S. military power as a political ploy or as a political toy for their own power.
And if any of you were watching the images out of Charlotte, last night I stayed up late watching what was happening. To me, that is a war zone. For the National Guard to be deployed at individuals, community members who are just asking for transparency, accountability, and justice for the murder of people, and to be responded to by tear gas, by pepper balls, by riot and riot gear, we're not talking about policing responses anymore or justice responses. We're talking about a paramilitary, military force responding to everyday people. In D.C., the Metropolitan Police Department uses the practices of jump outs taken from the IDF in protests, the kind of responses we've seen from particularly the Department of Homeland Security fusion centers, which we know that the Department of Homeland Security was created right after 9/11 to, quote unquote, find the domestic terrorist and the domestic threat here. Well, today, those fusion centers that were supposed to be deployed to take care of national security issues around big terrorist attacks and also environmental issues, big disasters, are being turned on protesters and activists right here. We know that more than 7 Muslim-majority nations have been bombed. This has continued whether it is under Bush or the Obama administration. And so sometimes we tend to think of, quote unquote, the conservatives or Republicans as being the ones that are racist, but really give a pass to, I think, liberal and progressives who engage in racism as well.
Is there anyone who doesn't think that the wars that are going on in the streets of our country are not connected to the wars that we're proliferating around the world?
Native Americans today are still exploited, still stuck on reservations, and still suffering under government management. It isn't surprising that the Black Lives Matter movement has embraced the cause of the natives, currently seen in opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Palestinian activists in that country, which also suffers under the heavy hand of U.S. racism, and the Black Lives Matter movement offer mutual support. Perhaps more than ever before, divergent groups that experience U.S. exploitation are aligning with each other to achieve mutual goals for justice.
The United Nations says it's more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier today. How are the systems of patriarchy and war mutually reinforcing? Shout it out. Domination. Concept of power. Concept of power. Violence. Profiteering, violence. So Carol Christ says, patriarchy is a system developed and controlled by powerful men in which women, children, other men, and nature itself, Mother Nature, are dominated. Let me say at the outset, this is Carol speaking, and I subscribe to this, it is not in the nature of men to dominate through violence. Patriarchy is a system that originated in history, which means that it is neither eternal nor inevitable. It is a condition that was born at a particular moment in history. It's not like gravity that came with the cosmos. And that which has been constructed can be deconstructed when the women have a seat at the table to end civil wars. What have we found? Does anybody know? That's right. She read the study. They're much more likely to be enduring and sustainable. After 5 years, the agreements have stuck. Why? Thank you. Brilliant. Because the women are addressing the root causes of the conflict. They're not just interested in, okay, how many seats in parliament is my party going to get? Let's carve up the pie. No, they're asking what gave rise to the conflict in the first place. Was it climate change giving rise to a scarcity of water in northern Kenya so that herdspeople are fighting over the watering hole and grazing rights? Is it the fact that the distribution of aid contaminated community relationships?
So what do we mean by a racial settler state? So settlers, in coming to a particular territory, seek the removal of an indigenous population, along with the creation of a racial hierarchy of subsequent domination. Now, removal, in other words, this is not just colonialism. It's a subset of colonialism. It's not just setting up territory. It's basically coming to a particular place and saying that the indigenous population will be removed. The settler state is not seeking any kind of mixture with the indigenous population. It is seeking, it will rape them, but it is not interested in mixing with them. It seeks their removal, and the removal can be annihilation, or the removal can be just forcing people off the land. And so we have many examples of racial settler states on this planet, the United States being a very successful one. You also have South Africa, of course, the former Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. You have Israel, Australia, New Zealand, all having certain things in common, as is Ireland, which was in many ways a very successful prototype for the development of a settler state.
I once heard an American veteran who had fought in Iraq speak. ironically at a peace conference, he told me and the audience that the real reason behind the Iraq War was oil. I agreed with him, and I asked him if he was willing to die for oil. He adamantly affirmed that he was, because otherwise his children would be paying a lot more for gasoline in the future. He felt that the United States had a right to the resources of a sovereign country. His remarks are a stunning example of American thinking about war and the indifference we have to the lives and rights of others outside our country.
And one of the things I should say something about settler states is that God is a very important factor in every settler state. And it's really interesting when you look at this, because what happens is that there's this telephone line between God and the settlers. And it always exists. If you look at Northern Ireland, you look at South Africa, you look at the United States, God always tells the settlers, this is your land, right? This is your land, you can have it. Now, why God doesn't get on another phone line and tell the indigenous people, hey, I cut a deal with them, it's time to move, I hope you really understand, sorry, right? But that never seems to happen, right?
These Puritans came here in 1630, and these Puritans had a very, very specific ideology, which is absolutely psychotic. And one of the things that they believed was that they, aside from being sexually deprived by choice, which is a whole other world, they believed that they were superior to the rest of the world. And this is a part of our strain in the American psyche. And one of the reasons that we have so many bases and why we're so preoccupied with our military and with race. And the Puritans believed that the white Puritans were superior to everybody else. It wasn't just black people and Indians. They were superior to Jews and to Protestants, other Protestants, and certainly Catholics as well. And so there is this word they use called city on the hill, a phrase that Reagan picked up, of course. And they believe that it was their job to purify the world.
So German prisoners of war in troop trains and buses going through the U.S. South could go into locations that African American soldiers were prohibited from entering.
So Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence started to compile a chronology of sexual violence, sexual crimes committed by U.S. soldiers in Okinawa since 1945. The number, we hesitated to say this number, hundreds, of course, but we know that this is not even a tip of the larger iceberg, because you know the nature of sexual crimes. It's more difficult for victims of sexual crimes to report the case, and because victims are often blamed. The prostitution is an institutional part of the military, as you may know. That still exists in Okinawa. That still exists in Korea, around the bases in Korea, and I'm a little bit off the topic, but there's a lawsuit brought by women in Camptown in Korea who worked in prostitution 1960s and 70s, Korean women who do not have any social security or whatsoever. After many years of that was their work, but they got older, and the U.S. military bases in Korea are now going through, transformation. They moved to different locations. These women got older in their 60s and 70s. They do not have any means of the support of their life, and most of all, they face very strong discrimination within Korean society because of their profession.
There are alternatives to war and preparations for war as a means of achieving security. See the new book in your packet, A Global Security System, An Alternative to War, published by World Beyond War.
And we call it the hardware and the software. So there are very specific proposals in there needed to abolish war and the war machine, such as the reform of the United Nations, ending drone warfare. And then there are very specific proposals on how to create the software surrounding it, which is creating cultures of peace.
I mean, what we were able to do, maybe because Notre Dame is generally sometimes a conservative campus, was the little pockets of liberal voices and their different issues would come together and help promote each other's events. So even though that's just a small way of helping, it would be like my Global Zero Nuclear Disarmament group would go to rallies and go to the Black Lives Matter die-in, and then their members would come. And so kind of working together in that sense.
Have you noticed that someone called a socialist got a lot of votes in the... That runs contrary to anything anyone, I suspect, in this room believed was possible, that language was accessible to the American people. And I think the lesson there is that it is time to open up much bigger and more fundamental questions and not worry about what it is, oh, you can't say that. Look at a system, capitalism, that must inherently expand in order to succeed. If it doesn't expand, it collapses and falls. So the pressure of the whole system was built on the notion, and this is well developed in the historical literature by now, was somehow we need world markets, and somehow we need investment outlets, and somehow we need raw materials, the most obvious ones being oil in the Middle East. The next time we have a big banking crisis, the banks have to become public rather than private after we take them over. Or General Motors and Chrysler go down, and we make them into mass transit and high-speed rail systems. And what people are doing is building co-ops, worker-owned companies, publicly owned land trusts at the local level, public banks. Philadelphia and Santa Fe are setting up city-owned banks, like the Public Bank of North Dakota. If you don't like corporate capitalism, and you don't like state socialism, what the hell do you want? And indeed, there are a lot of people beginning to actually ask that question intelligently. That is, what is the structure, starting at the neighborhood or the community? How do you look at cities, city socialism or community socialism or neighborhood ownership or cooperative ownership? How do you build up and principles the Catholic Church calls subsidiarity, from the bottom up, growing right up to those big things that have to be at larger scale? What is the role of regionalism?
The results of the war economy are in all of our communities. And they're mostly in the communities of color that are connected to our communities. How related are we to them? So when I say growing a peace economy, that means me going into a community that is at the effect of the war economy. War serves the war economy. Just FYI, we have to end the economy to end war because it's served the war economy, as Gar described and so many people have described today. So how do I go into the effects of that in my community and ask them what they need from me? Everybody popped up ideas until it became, we could ask local restaurants to give us a night where we all pay for our own meal, but we invite the Muslim community in with our community and we just talk about what is Islamophobia. We listen to them, we talk about our fears, we just share. And this woman had heard that, and she's now had 4. She calls them T's for Peace. The first thing you do when you start to grow a local peace economy is you divest yourself from the war economy. And that's like really a whole meditation on where do I bank, how do I, what do I do?
So building peace economy has 2 parts. One is to cut the military budget and reinvest. It's not enough just to cut the military budget. We got to move money to the civilian side of the economy to create what economists call sort of demand pull, pulling workers, communities, and businesses into civilian areas of work. And the other thing that's required is sort of overcoming inertia, that is helping workers, communities, and businesses kind of get from here to there, and involving targeted assistance and also building models showing that there's life after defense contracting. What I've been saying since the post-Cold War period, what we said back then was we need a new national mission to take the place of winning the Cold War. And what we said back then is even clearer today that that new national mission should be creating an environmentally sustainable economy. As the planet warms, it's even clearer that this is an absolutely urgent priority.
The biggest industry in the history of the world will be photovoltaic cells. I'm telling you right now. You know that scene in The Graduate where the guy comes up to Dustin Hoffman and he says, plastics. Okay, so photovoltaics. I mean, that is really what's going to happen on this earth. And I am actually, this is a sentence I never thought I'd say, but I am moving to Los Angeles because I think that Los Angeles, it could be the first, will be the first megalopolis on this planet to be operated by solar energy.
Alternatives to war would essentially lean very, very heavily on diplomacy, on aid, and on negotiations, on nonviolent peacekeeping, nonviolent protection of other people. But what we're up against, of course, is so huge, with trillions of dollars of resources, human ingenuity, capacities being poured into what I would call the rat hole of United States military spending. So the alternative, diplomacy, negotiation, wise use of United States resources for, I'll just say the word aid, and then peacekeeping and protection. The role that I'm playing in this panel is to talk about unwise usage of aid. And I think the place where we can help our neighbors and friends and coworkers and others understand why it is that we don't trust the United States government to be engaged in aiding other people through militarized processes. I mean, as though this idea of humanitarian war could ever be anything other than an ugly oxymoron. The place where I think it can be so well understood and tragically understood is Afghanistan. And so I'd like to say a few things about experiences of a number of us dating back to 2010 in visiting Afghanistan. A number of us were there in 2011. And 21 major non-governmental organizations in Afghanistan had come together and signed a paper called Nowhere to Turn, Nowhere to Hide. They gave us an embargoed copy of it and said, please keep this quiet because we're sure that when it's released, it's going to get worldwide media attention. Well, the media treated it with about a total yawn. But in this paper, these 21 non-governmental organizations in Afghanistan were begging the United States military to stay very far away from any kind of humanitarian action because their actions were becoming jeopardized. Why? Because people so hated the United States military presence that they would kind of conflate any kind of humanitarian effort with United States militarism. Well, $104 billion, and now I actually just read in Military Times yesterday that it's up to $111 billion. More money than was spent on the Marshall Plan has been spent on non-military expenditures in Afghanistan. $104 billion. When I'm there in the wintertime, there's electricity every other day. 20% of the people have access to potable water. The Taliban would seem to now be controlling close to 70% of the country, and the presence of poppy production is so immense that John Sapko, the head of the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, estimates that it would be 440,000 football fields.
So unarmed civilian protection in practice. The way that Nonviolent Peace Force does it is based on 3 pillars: that we are nonpartisan, that we are nonviolent, and that we rely and are guided by the primacy of local actors. Our teams are specially trained professionals. They are paid for their work. They work full-time, 24/7, on civilian protection. They come from a variety of different countries, currently from 26 different countries, with at least half of the civilian protectors coming from the host country. 50% of the people doing the direct protection are women, and that is key in terms of our ability to be able to protect. And I contrast that with the Department of Peacekeeping at the UN the armed peacekeepers, where 3% of the armed peacekeepers are women. We're strategic. This is based upon ongoing conflict and context analysis. We're nimble. We can move quickly. We live in the communities that are under threat, and we're cost effective. It costs us about $50,000 a year to train, to recruit, to transport, to insure, to house, to feed, and to pay an unarmed civilian protector. For those of us who are paying our U.S. taxes, it costs them $1 million per soldier per year in Afghanistan. So we're the fiscal conservatives.
I was in charge of policy towards Sierra Leone in the UK when I was deputy head of the Africa Department of the British Foreign Office. Sierra Leone is an interesting example of colonial legacy problems which destroy a country. And you usually find most of the conflicts in Africa, which we describe as tribal, actually date back. The root cause is colonial settlement and the moving of peoples from their land and the resulting dislocation. In Sierra Leone, it's interesting, because Sierra Leone, which neighbours Liberia, was the British example. It was a colony set up for freed slaves. So the people who set it up had ostensibly good motives. The problem is, of course, to the locals, if you're being dispossessed and moved off your land, you don't actually care if it's a white man or a freed slave who's doing it to you. What happened in Sierra Leone was you ended up with a coastal elite of freed slaves who spoke English and therefore had advantages in trading with Europe. And the native population was displaced, and the tribes of the interior were neglected. And that fed in to extremely corrupt governments and into a huge amount of resentment among the peoples of the interior, made worse by some terrible colonial atrocities. There was what's known as the Hut Tax War in Sierra Leone in the 1870s, when the British fairly well exterminated large parts of the interior population by imposing a tax on their huts, literally. And when they refused to pay this tax, people's homes and villages were simply destroyed and populations were massacred. People don't suddenly erupt into chopping people's arms off without something having gone terribly wrong in history that turned them that way. This was something the British government didn't want to hear. When I was saying to them, listen, what we have to do is find the grievances and causes of extreme poverty and extreme alienation that causes this kind of thing to happen, they were saying, no, we just need to shoot them. I found myself in the year 1999 in Lomé in Togo, locked in a hotel room with the Sierra Leone government, with the representatives of the rebels, the RUF, with representatives of the governments of Liberia and Libya. At the time, that was Charles Taylor's people and Colonel Gaddafi's people, with an American ambassador named Joe Melrose and his staff, and the United Nations, who were cheering the talks, and we had to try to get a peace treaty together in these circumstances. And when I say we were locked in, we were literally locked in. You would get shot if you tried to go out. Even I might have got shot if I tried to go out. A German diplomat was shot dead in Togo in 1995 by the Togolese. So it was not a safe place. And I recall sitting there before the Americans turned up a week late, I know not why. But when we, in the very first session, I sat there and I looked around, and there were all these rebels from the RUF. There were two very hard men from the Sierra Leonean government. There were 3 representatives of Colonel Gaddafi and 4 representatives of Charles Taylor. And I thought, do you know, I'm the only man in the room who's never killed anybody. I got to know some of the rebels, and I want to tell you about a guy called Colonel Isaac. Now, Colonel Isaac had killed over 100 people himself. He had killed over 100 people. And he chopped the arms of hundreds more. Personally, done that. Colonel Isaac was a colonel in the rebels, and he was 19 years old. He had, at the age of 8, been captured by Charles Taylor's people and forced to kill his own mother and father. He'd then been used as a child soldier by Charles Taylor's people. He'd fought in the Liberian Civil War, and at one stage he'd been shipped off with other child soldiers to fight in the war in Angola. And that's something I didn't realize before I got there, that there was a traffic in child soldiers for money around Africa. And he had, he was, in many ways, he was a terrible war criminal. He'd killed hundreds of people. He was a monster, but he was also, an 8-year-old boy who'd had to kill his own parents, who'd seen his sisters raped and murdered in front of him, and who had been totally dehumanized and had never had a chance. And I'm not a very conventional diplomat at all, and as you may notice. My negotiating tactic, if you like, was to sit round and to socialize with them, not only see them in the formal sessions. And I don't actually take hard drugs myself, just because I don't happen to like them, not from any moral reason. But they would sit around taking cocaine, and I would sit around drinking whiskey, and we'd talk deep into the evening. And Colonel Isaac's hope was from the peace process that he would get an education, that he'd be taught how to read and write, and eventually he wanted to go to college. That's what he hoped would come out of it. And we were putting together a peace treaty whereby the rebels, the RUF, would get 4 or 5 ministers in the government. They were bidding for 8 ministers in the government. Governor Sierra Leone wanted to give them 2 ministers. But you imagine that. You're putting all the people who would have been put into that government were mass murderers. There's no doubt about it. And you think of the ethical difficulties that arise here, because they are really profound. And I found them personally profound. I mean, it wasn't just a question of an intellectual exercise. I would go back every night. Some nights I would cry after hearing some of these stories and try to figure out how we did it. Eventually, we did manage to piece together the signing of a peace agreement.
The end of war, the end